Let's start, and I suspect there'll be some more people coming in, but we've got a strong group of attendees here. So good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon now. My name is Mark Cooper. I am the CEO of the Saskatchewan Construction Association, one of, I think, 10 organizations that is co-hosting this session here today. I'll be moderating, and hopefully most of the time though you'll be hearing from our four panelists. I'd like to thank the other associations that have been part of hosting this session. So that includes the Regina Construction Association, the Saskatoon Construction Association, the Moose Jaw and Prince Albert Construction Associations, the Saskatchewan Construction Safety Association, the Merit Contractors Association of Saskatchewan, the Saskatoon Home Builders Association, the Regina Home Builders Association, the Heavy Construction Association, and the Heavy Construction Safety Association. If there's one thing construction loves, it's associations. We've got lots of them, and we love working together. So thank you to all of my partners for working together to invite members to participate in this. I think this is the largest number of attendees we've had for one of these webinars we've done as part of our COVID response team. We're doing this webinar today to talk specifically about the challenge that employers may be facing in looking to implement vaccine mandates, what's coming provincially, what can be expected, what the rules are, and how companies can navigate this time. Most of you are likely familiar with Zoom, but in case you're not, a couple of things that I can note. On your screen, you should be, if you have video, you should be able to see 5 folks: Candice, Rodelle, Clint, Ken, and myself. We cannot see or hear you, but you should be able to see us and hear us if you're on the phone. You can provide questions through the question and answer feature in Zoom, and we'd encourage you to do that. We'll answer them as best as we can. That'll be the primary way for you to do that. And if you leave the webinar, you can always rejoin at any time by using the link that you received in registration. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available after, as well as a printout of the question and answers that are provided. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists, and we can get right into the questions. We'll start with Candice Grant. So Candice is a partner with Robertson Stromberg, and she has a broad range of civil litigation experience with a focus on employment matters and municipal law. And so as Candice said just a couple of minutes ago, she's been very busy during the pandemic because there's been lots of employment questions. She represents all parties to employment disputes, including employees, employers, management, and union. And she's got extensive experience in wrongful dismissal and human rights cases with a focus on real and practical solutions. So very relevant experience in this time. And Candice was one of the originating members of our COVID response team. So thanks for joining us today, Candice. Next, I'd like to introduce Rodelle Genoway. So Rodelle is the president of Untapped Potential Business Consulting, and has extensive experience providing coaching, consulting, and training to businesses. She's got direct experience in construction and in manufacturing. And her areas of expertise include human resources, leadership, strategy, and continuous improvement. And Rodelle was also one of the founding members of our COVID response team. So thanks for coming back for round 2, Rodelle. And next, I'd like to introduce Clint and Ken. So Clint and Ken are both with the Government of Saskatchewan. Clint is the Deputy Minister of Immigration and Career Training, and Ken Dueck is the Executive Director of the province's Business Response Team. And Clint's involved with that group as well. And they've been instrumental since really the start of the pandemic in being the primary point of contact for businesses in Saskatchewan, trying to understand the rules in place for them and how to navigate supports as well. And it's been a fantastic resource for businesses that have really struggled. So I want to thank Clint and Ken and through them to their whole team for the work that they've done over the last, it's been a long time, I guess now, but well over a year now, and I appreciate that. And Clint, maybe I give you a moment to say a few opening words here before we dive into questions.
Good. Thanks, Mark, and hello to everybody out there. This we can't see you and hear you type of thing is a bit of getting used to, but here we are. I just want to give a really quick overview. This is the first time some of us have had a conversation. We've met with some of you in the past, I'm sure. So part of the business response team, I just wanted to give a really quick overview of what it is that we do and who is this business response team. What do they do? So our primary function is to provide interpretation on some of the public health orders historically when we had a reopen Saskatchewan plan. we would be the group who businesses would call and talk about, well, what if I'm 3 feet, or what if I'm 6 feet, and how many people can I have? Or what if I'm having a personal gathering? Because it's not simply business that we've been responding to. It is weddings, and it was private gatherings, and is an ice shack considered indoor and outdoor? And we would work with our health colleagues to try to provide a consistent interpretation. And I really have to say thank you to everybody out there for being patient with us over the past year. This stuff, and you've heard us say it 1,000 times, the situation continues to be fluid. And this is what we know today. There was a point in time last year when this is what we know, and it is 12:08. That might be subject to change. And we're getting into that sort of realm now. So we're working out of a public health order, a couple of public health orders, a couple of sets of regulations, but we don't use the reopen plan. We do take some of our information from historical interpretation of these things as we move forward. But that is really what we try to do. We're not here to provide legal advice. That's why Candice is here, to not give legal advice either specifically, but we do try to provide some good direction. We're trying to figure out ways to make things happen, to try to move answers forward where you're not left in limbo for very long. We've been trying really hard to do that. Ken, did I miss anything on here? I guess the other thing I'd point out really quickly is we're not an approving body per se. The business response team that we have, we do provide a lot of direct feedback and questions and answers. But when it comes to submitting a plan, we have taken a look and we'll provide a review, but we're not an approving body per se. So it's, I have this plan in place for my employees and employers or patrons. Can you take a look and make sure we're on side? We can provide some general commentary on what we see, but we're in no way, shape, or form an approving body. So I just wanted to let folks know sort of who we are and what we do. That's sort of a brief overview. Ken, did I miss anything or anything you want to add?
Well, thanks, Clint. Maybe just a couple of things. So we are in a position now where we've got 2 public health orders in place and fairly recent, Friday coming into play. And of course, last week we had the employers' COVID-19 emergency regulations come into play as well. So there's a lot of information for folks to absorb. So we're definitely here to help answer those questions and to help businesses in particular work their way through those problems. As Clint said, we don't have the Reopen Saskatchewan plan anymore, and the 164 pages of related guidelines that went along with that. And I'm somewhat thankful for that because that was an awful lot to interpret. But we do have the public health orders, and certainly here to answer any questions related to the application of those, as well as the employers' COVID-19 emergency regulations.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Ken and Clint, for that. I had asked previously if Candice and Rodelle wanted to say anything at the start, but they said they wanted to just jump into questions. So maybe I'm actually going to put the first question back to Clint and Ken. This is just if you can give a brief overview at 12:11 today of where we're at, roughly speaking, in terms of the regulatory environment that is a new regulatory environment now that enables private employers to require vaccine mandates. So if you can give a bit of an overview of that at a high level, that'd be great.
So I'll give a brief overview, and Ken, feel free to jump in. So with the employer-employee regs that have been created, which are now, of course, posted, there's a set of Q&As that go with it. The original intent behind this was to provide a bit of coverage for employers to be asking for these things. So there was, back in the springtime, a number of businesses were starting to want to go down this road, and they were looking for some protective measures around liability and concern, and in a respectful way. And I do have to actually identify that. Businesses have been really been fantastic. I know there's a bit of anxiety out there, but the sense of urgency is only because everyone wants to do the right thing. What can I do? What can't I do? So from that lens, we tried to create as a government, what's that protective measure where employers, if you want to require proof of vaccination, or proof of negative test, what kind of protections can be put in place to clarify this? And that's what that set of regulations does. We look at it as it's a sort of a big sandbox that's in there. And so the protective measure for employers is the language around proof of vaccination or negative test is intentional. Having the out for employees who choose or can't or won't be vaccinated, having that offshoot was part of the language that was very consciously discussed internally here. And that's where I'm going to say that safe parameter is. We wanted to provide some coverage, but within that, when you start to deviate from what's prescribed in that set of regulations, that's when we're saying this is the protection that's been provided. If you want to take a step outside of that sandbox, you don't necessarily have that same level of coverage, and your situation needs to be a little bit different. That's easy for me to say simply because that's how it was created. The reality of it is every employer-employee situation is going to be different. Trying to create a set of broad-based regulations that protect the employer to do these things certainly was the intent. But as you well know on this call, there are very different circumstances across. Your employer contract is different. You might have a unionized environment with a collective agreement that might impact sort of what's going on. That's when you want to get involved with your own, your legal counsel, your HR shop. Did I get that right, Ken?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So, we've got I've got a couple of questions that have come in earlier that I want to share. And I've got one in the Q&A here already from Rebecca. So maybe we'll start with Rebecca's question. She's asking, she's curious about the liability issue with WCB and other insurance if we mandate vaccines for our company. So I think the question is, do we expose ourselves to further liability here when it comes to this if we require vaccines? So I don't know if Candice or Rodelle, if one of you would like to take a first crack at that from your experience, and like to hear it, then open it up to anybody.
Sure, maybe I'll start and then turn it over to Rodelle to add in anything I might have missed. So I think just to clarify, and Clint and Ken have touched on this already, the current regulations speak to having a policy, an optional policy for private employers that either provides for vaccines or testing. So most of your employers are not going to be in a position where you are actually mandating vaccination. And from a legal perspective, we wouldn't recommend that you go that far. So to the extent that you're putting in a policy that falls in line with the new regulations, where you're either having your employees confirm that they've been fully vaccinated, or alternatively provide that testing results on a weekly basis, I would not have any particular concerns from a WCB or a liability perspective. I expect most employers are going to be relying on that provision in the Saskatchewan Employment Act that talks to implementing regulations in good faith and those sorts of provisions. We've had a few discussions with some private insurers just around benefit use and that sort of thing. And to date anyway, as at 12:15 on October 4th, the information that we're getting is that to the extent that an employee is out of the workplace due to an illness or an injury, standard rules will apply if the insurer determines that that is a legitimate illness that they're away for. They're going to be covered for that, but it's not going to change things liability-wise for the employer.
So Candice, just to actually follow up on that. So if somebody is not there because they're not vaccinated or refusing to provide tests, then does that change the requirements around benefits or anything like that? Like, how does that affect if there's a requirement in place with some accommodation and the employee is choosing not to comply?
I suspect that an employee who chooses to not comply with either of those options is going to find themselves without any coverage. To the extent that the employee, say, has a bad reaction to a vaccine or is out of the workplace as a result of a COVID infection, those people are likely going to still have benefit coverage. But for those who just refuse to comply with either of the options, I can't speak conclusively. You need to follow up with your specific insurance policy. But I would suspect in most cases there's not going to be coverage for that.
Great. Just a note, Candice, we heard from, and I was thinking the same thing, we're having a little bit of hard time hearing you, so if you can move a little closer to your mic, that'd be good. And Lawrence was just clarifying, did you say that mandating vaccination is not required, or sorry, is not recommended? And I think what you said was that, doing that without any accommodation would not be recommended. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, the regulations at this point, essentially, and I'm sure Clint or Ken will jump in if I'm misinterpreting them, but my understanding is that the regulations say basically you must give your employees the option to test instead of vaccinate. And so to the extent that our recommendation at all times is that you do what you're legally entitled to do, we would have a difficult time recommending a policy that only provides for mandatory vaccinations and then presumably some sort of human rights exemption on that. So at this point, our recommendation is very much that your policies would have that option to provide negative tests as opposed to strictly mandating vaccines.
Okay, thanks, Candice. Rodelle, anything that you'd like to add to that response from Candice?
Not overly, just from my experience with WCB, they want you to file a WCB report if someone in the workplace tests positive for COVID. So there's that on top of like the whole vaccine thing, but yeah, nothing more related to that question anyway.
Okay, this is one that I'm going to come to you first here, Rodelle, on, and again, open it up to anybody. And that's always the case. I think panelists all know that, but feel free to jump in anytime. If you unmute yourself, I'm going to assume that you want to say something and come to you. So this comes from Quebecs. Like many businesses, we have one employee that has a very strong opinion on vaccination. He's a good worker and we don't want to lose him, but a lot of job sites are wanting proof of vaccination. Can you give us any advice? This is our only employee who's not vaccinated.
So the other option, like Candice had talked about, was the showing a negative COVID test. It all depends if the company has a policy in place for that. I know there was a question, and I might be jumping ahead a bit, of just like how do you deal with like the frustration?
Yeah. I'd like you to go there, yeah, if you could, that'd be great. And
like, this is the HR person talking, but it's having like a genuine conversation with that person or the group, really honing in on like the purpose of it. Like, it's not just a random decision we made as an organization, like really talking about, here's the reason why we're making this a policy. It could be because our client is requiring it in order to be on a job site with them. That's the business case for it. Don't be afraid to show vulnerability, like as a manager. You can't communicate enough of even sharing the things that you aren't able to share as an employer. So just an example, an organization I was with, there was a bit of uproar when people are like, well, I want to know who tested positive. Am I working beside them? So that was a lesson learned from the employer's perspective of communicating with people of, here's what we aren't able to tell you and here's why. Just listening to people's concerns and communicating all that you know and just showing vulnerability.
Thanks, Rodelle. Okay, so unless anybody's unmuting, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question then. So this one comes from Lonnie McKenzie. I think Ken or Clint, I'll come to you first for this. So there's been some confusion around the approved testing, and there's a number of questions in here about this. How can more clarity be gained on this? So what testing is approved? What's that process? Can somebody provide some clarity on approved testing?
You want that one, Ken?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. It is a bit of it is a question people are asking for sure. So the government of Saskatchewan is accepting as proof of a negative COVID-19 test, either an antigen test or a PCR test from one of the private suppliers within the province. And that is intended to ensure that there's a level of record keeping that goes along with that. So these are sites that produce a record of that test, who it was administered to, and the date and the negative result. Having a point of care test that somebody maybe took home, got through their workplace or through the school is a really good screening tool, but there's really no way to determine when or who that test was applied to. So that's one of the reasons for the requirements for that negative test. Now, that being said, the employer's COVID-19 emergency regulations are opt-in. And a workplace, perhaps such as a meat processing facility who's been using antigen testing procured through the federal government as a screening tool for its employees for a number of months already, might feel that that is a sufficient level of testing for their employees for their own particular policy. But the ones that the government of Saskatchewan are using and the ones that will be valid for patronage at certain businesses like restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and liquor stores would be those ones that are described.
So I'll just add a little chime in on this one. Ken was exactly right. The regs between employer and employee are opt-in. These are voluntary, the employer may. And I'm going to jump into section 5 that does talk about testing. And the language in here is for the purposes of testing, the act and unless otherwise agreed to by the employer, have negative test and so on and so forth. So there is discretion and there is latitude. The example that Ken described is a good one. If you have something that's working for you, you do have a fair bit of latitude as an employer to do what you're comfortable with regarding testing and that sort of thing. That's why that language is in there around unless otherwise agreed to by the employer. So here's something that we're doing as a government. There's a mirror set of regs for public employers within government. But in this particular case, you do have some latitude to figure out what's going to work for you. And so that covers things like cost. Within the provincial government, we are not going to be covering the cost of any of the tests that Ken described for our employees. We're not going to be spending taxpayers' money on this. That was a determination that was made. For private business, of which you are one, you can if you want. There's nothing prohibiting you from doing it.
So that's good clarification. There was a question in there about that, which we can come back to. So somebody in the chat, just Jason Haidamako, I just asked section 5 of what? So and one of you may have referenced section 5, and I apologize. I was reading through the question, so I didn't hear who referenced it.
Sorry, it's in the employer-employee regs that have been posted. I think they got posted on Friday officially. You can find that on the Government of Saskatchewan website. You can go to we have a link on it on our page for supports for business. So there will be a link to those regulations and a section 5 of those regs.
And Candice has just put it in the chat there. Thanks, Candice. And we'll make sure to send that out as well. So that was from specifically the new regulations that were put out for private sector employers. It's okay, perfect, thanks. Rodelle, there's 2 questions asked clarifying something that you said that if we can just come back to. So the questions were, did Rodelle indicate that we are to report a positive test result for an employee to WCB? And then I'm just going to find the other one on here. And then does this still apply if the employee has not been in any contact with coworkers? For an example, they're on vacation when symptoms present.
Yeah, so that's what WCB has told me directly when I was with another employer, was that they would like all positive cases reported to them through the E1. They say it's more just for tracking purposes. I think it would be rare that it would cause an actual WCB claim. I don't know if that's actually been the case, if there has been a legit WCB claim for a positive COVID case, but yeah, they want the tracking.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so a couple of questions here. They're coming in fast and furious, which is great. Oh, Ken, you have your hand up. Did you want to say something? Go ahead, please.
Just an addition, if somebody tests positive through a rapid test or an antigen test through workplace or regular screening through one of the private vendors, It is strongly recommended that that person seek a PCR test as a follow-up, just to ensure that that case is indeed positive. And of course, in the meantime, be self-isolating.
Okay, good, thank you. A question here from Amy Gabriel in the chat is, this is the specific situation question. She needs to send some employees to a training facility that requires proof of vaccination. Is she able to ask whether anybody won't be able to attend the training because of those requirements? So, you know, yeah, a question if maybe they don't have a mandate in place or anything like that, but are they able to ask about the status of vaccination? Or whether, or if you can't ask specifically about the status of vaccination, whether people are able to attend, like how do they handle that when somebody else has a site that requires this, but as an employer, they don't have a policy in place? Nobody's coming off mute. Come on, somebody wants to tackle this one.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that one, Mark. Generally speaking, I would encourage anybody to follow the policy in place at whatever site that you're at. So regardless of whether or not you as an employer have a policy, if there's a facility or a building where you're at, or an organization that you're working with that is requiring that, I would recommend that you comply with their policy.
So how did, practically speaking, how do they do that? I mean, Candice or Rodelle, like, are we in a different world right now with this, where maybe employers can ask those questions where they couldn't before? What advice would you give to somebody if they came asking you that question?
Yeah, I think we are in a little bit of a different world than we've typically seen. I mean, pre-pandemic, our advice to employers was always don't ask for health information, subject to a few very narrow exceptions. And I think one of those exceptions has always been your ability to make reasonable decisions for the management of your workplace. And so to the extent that you have a third-party service provider that has put in a vaccination requirement, you know, as the person coordinating that training, I think you're going to have to make some inquiries to ensure that your employees are compliant with those policies. Obviously, like any other kind of health inquiry, it should be done in a discreet and confidential manner. But I think this is one of those circumstances where it is appropriate to at least ask the question.
Thank you. Okay, so next question I want to go to here is from my colleague Stu Niebergall from the Regina Home Builders Association. He's just he's making note that I think it was last week, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission posted a statement that they would not look at somebody who has refused to get vaccinated against COVID due to personal preferences as something that would be protected. I'm paraphrasing what they said, but how does that statement factor in here? And I know they're not the only Human Rights Commission across Canada that has done that. And does that provide extra clarity for employers? Maybe Candice, we'll start with you on that one.
Sure. I don't know that this actually does provide clarity or change anything so much as it just affirms what the existing law is. And the Human Rights Commission has a fairly narrow mandate, and its mandate is to ensure that individuals are not being discriminated against on prohibited grounds. And those prohibited grounds, they're set out in the code if you care to look them up. The two that are most relevant for this discussion are religion and disability. And so to the extent that you have individuals who are choosing not to become vaccinated for reasons that are not related to one of those prohibited grounds, it's not something that the Human Rights Commission really has the authority to look at in the first place. So I take their statement simply to be a confirmation that they're not going to be in a position to assist those who are choosing for other reasons not to become vaccinated.
Okay, so really it was more of a red herring that they were sort of responding to the fact that, you know, this isn't, people think this is a remedy available to them, but it's really not.
I think that's fair.
Well, maybe just a quick add-on to that. We've been talking about that as a public service. when people are seeking, and you probably do have some employees who are out trying to get a quote unquote a doctor's note exempting them from requiring a vaccination, from our perspective and the way that these regs are written, is that's not a thing. What that does is, okay, you don't need to be vaccinated. Okay, well, we have an off ramp for that. That does not get you out of doing the testing requirements. So we have gone through that here. You know what? The fact is, we do have, I'm going to say, choice, preference, religious grounds, what have you. That does not give you any special permission to not have to require the testing. So I just share that with folks because that's something that we've thrown around here as well. And a lot of people out there in the world seem to think, well, if I can get a doctor's note that says I can't get a vaccination for whatever reason, it might be legitimate, might be questionable. That's fine. We can certainly respect that, but that doesn't give you a free pass from doing the testing.
Okay, there's an interesting question here. There's a lot of interesting questions, so bear with me as we bounce around from topic to topic because I'm just trying to keep track of where we're at. But question here from Fred about the emergency nature of this. So I'll just read the question. Being that the changes to the Employment Act are an emergency measure, creating a policy requiring mandatory vaccinations, won't that be breaking the law after the emergency measure is removed? So, you know, and we're seeing now lots of cases where, especially in the industrial area, but that there's a requirement for anybody coming on sites to be vaccinated. And sometimes, in some cases, we're seeing they're not even offering an off ramp. They're saying you must be vaccinated. What's going to happen in future day when we don't have to worry about COVID anymore? Like, are these regulations going to be withdrawn? Are people going to have to dispense with their policies? Has there been any consideration to what happens down the road?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're exactly right. The regulations are, you know, COVID-19 emergency regulations. They weren't embedded in an existing piece of regulations or statute for that very reason. Are these going to be in effect forever and a day? Well, as of today, sure. There's no end date to these regulations right now. But again, they were put in place to help the province combat COVID-19 and make sure that we have adequate health facilities and coverage and all of that wonderful stuff. That's why they're there. There will likely be at some point in time, well, cross your fingers. Let's hope that these regulations won't be required forever and a day. So that is part of the conversation. That's why they're structured in the way that they are, so that if we do get to a point where these can be repealed, they can be. So that'll be something that we'll be working with to make sure the message gets out there of when you can and can't do these things, with obviously a similar tone to this conversation of, well, what can we legally continue to do and what can we not do? I don't know what that looks like yet, but that is certainly part of the conversation about if we can hopefully one day repeal these regulations.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, couple of questions here from Dale Wasco. So when companies are not allowed to discriminate against medical issues or and it's not legal for them to ask about medical information, how as a company do we gather information as to the vaccine status of employees? And I mean, I think partly the answer is that you don't necessarily have to collect that information, or maybe you do. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to try and answer that. Forget what I just said. Who else wants to take an answer to that question? So how do you gather information when you're, you know, legal precedent says you're really not supposed to ask? Is this just part of that new world that we're now able to do, Candice?
Yeah, I think the answer is twofold. So as far as the policies go, you know, as has been shared already, there is that ability to opt into the system that would allow an employer to make those requirements under the new regulations. And so an employer who's following that policy has sort of an express right under those regulations to submit or to implement the policy and to require its employees to submit either the confirmation of vaccination or the test results. When we frame the question a little bit broader, you know, it's those questions about our third-party vendors require us to be vaccinated. How do we know who is and who isn't? Then it is sort of that shift that we've seen and that new ability to ask in terms of reasonable management of the workplace. And you know, there's obviously going to be some limits on that. I don't think it's a broad, you can now ask this in any circumstance, but if it can be tied to a legitimate work requirement, I think it's one of those unusual cases that justifies maybe being a little bit more, well, being able to ask some questions that you wouldn't necessarily be able to ask otherwise.
Thanks, Candice. The follow-up sort of to that is that that Dale had was because so if Clint, you made it clear that for private sector employers, the choice of whether you're going to require employees to pay for that testing is up to that employer. So the employer could, in theory, pay for that cost. Both decisions have ramifications for the employer. This question presupposes that the employer has decided to put the cost on the employee. So the question is, because you're forcing undue costs to employees to get the testing done, how will that hold up to any legal scrutiny when you've actually placed a financial burden that might be considered to be discriminatory against that employee?
Yeah, I mean, it does have the assumption that these costs, so I'm going to start with, these are voluntary. These are opt-in regs by the employer. So there's going to be determination at the employer level to make those decisions. There's going to be some trade-offs that need to be made. If you've decided to pass those costs along to your employees, okay. I'm not going to comment on the legal ground of this. I guess what I could say is there are other costs that employees are required to cover. And I'll pick on the public service as an example. We pay for our criminal record checks. So if you're going into a workplace, there are costs that you are expected to cover out of your own pocket. There are workarounds that the employer can do in this case. In terms of holding up to a legal scrutiny, I'm going to defer to our legal expert on the call today. But there are examples in the past where no, certain costs need to be covered by the employee, and those were laid out. When you look at what we're talking about in terms of testing, making sure that you're posting it, making sure there's an awareness, and making sure those things are made public, that you're not springing this on anybody, I would say that would go a long way. But again, I think Rodelle would probably be a better expert about communicating those messages as well.
Well, just to comment about it possibly being like a discriminatory thing, Candice touched on all of the prohibited grounds within the Human Rights Code, and forcing someone to pay for something like that's a requirement of the job. There's no, that's not a prohibited ground in the Human Rights Code. So it's irrelevant from that sense anyway.
It'd be like having to buy a hard hat or boots, right? Like it's the same, it's I guess a similar type of approach. Okay, so I'm gonna pivot here. Question from Nadine. Rodelle, maybe I'll get your perspective on this first. If an employee reacts negatively to the vaccine and is required to be away from work, is this now considered a lost time or workplace-related illness?
I wouldn't think it would be a WCB-related thing. I wouldn't. That would probably be a question directly for WCB, but just from my experience, I wouldn't see that being like a work-related illness or anything.
Anybody disagree with that? Okay, good, thanks. This next question comes from Miles. Regulations say the employer shall provide reasonable notice of new requirements. What would be considered a reasonable notice period before asking for either the negative test or proof of vaccination?
I'll throw out like, I don't know, a week or two, a couple weeks.
So I'll maybe toss it to Clint and Ken afterwards, but my reading of the regs actually doesn't talk about reasonable notice. It says you must provide notice of the requirements, and then it gives some options for ways that can take place. So I do know many of these that I've seen over the last week or so, they do become effective today with the expectation that employees will need to comply with the testing option until they are able to comply with the vaccination option. I certainly don't think it's a bad thing from a matter of HR or employee relations to give some time before this becomes effective. But I actually don't read the regs as necessarily saying you need to give that lead time.
I think there's some discretion here because, again, the opt-in nature of this, you don't have to adopt it on October 1st. You can do it later on. One of the questions that we did get was, wow, I just totally lost my train of thought. What I will talk about is the public service. We gave everybody notice on October 1st. We have a self-declaration that's live with a follow-up afterwards. That's how we're going to be managing our piece, and again, have employees' confidentiality respected at certainly the highest level, where it is just one check-in after the fact, but we do have the next couple of weeks open where people can go in and make their self-declaration. But what we have indicated is that one of the common questions we got was, well, what if on October 1st, I have an employee who comes up and kind of tugs on my sleeve and says, yeah, I'm not vaccinated, but I got my first one on Saturday. Are you exempt from that? I'm going to share with you the public sector's position on that is, that's awesome. I'm glad you got your first shot. However, you are still not meeting the definition of fully vaccinated. And until you are with your second dose 2 weeks, after the fact, you are still required to do the testing regimen. So we have given some upfront notice of a couple of weeks or so, but we do know that some people are going to be caught with, I'm not fully vaccinated yet. What happens to me? That's what we're doing as a public service. Again, you as an employer can choose to do something a bit different. Again, these are opt-in. So you do have some discretion on that front.
Right. So I'm just doing some quick looking here as people have posted some information in the chat about WCB and other spots. So it appears that, and WCB in Alberta, and I'm just looking at the regulations here, WCB Saskatchewan, it appears that they make the distinction between immunization as a requirement, so compulsory immunization as a requirement for or condition of employment, and voluntary immunization, and I suppose strictly speaking, this would qualify as voluntary immunization, since you do have an alternate method, right, which is testing. And certainly in a case where mandatory immunization is required, then WCB would consider that potentially as a compensable claim, although it always is based on the specific circumstances. Okay, so we've already answered the question of who pays for the testing, but there's a question here about whether or not there's an exit plan in place for the current government policies. So you talked a little bit about the fact that there would be an exit and that these were intended to be short-term. Clint, has there been any conversation that you can share at least about when we exit, what the conditions are for that?
I wish I had a better answer than I gave before. The responses to the current numbers, the current hospitalization numbers, all of those wonderful pieces. So until Dr. Shahab and the Premier and Cabinet are comfortable with where we're at, I can't see this changing. But those would be some of the factors that would be considered here. I honestly I don't have a forecast of what that's going to look like. It could be weeks or months. I don't know.
And building off of that, there's a question in the chat about, whether anybody's considered that there may be a requirement for ongoing boosters and future rounds, and, so without saying we're making this up as we go, but I mean, that's true of the entire world, right? To what extent can you share what thoughts have been given about whether, not when so much the regulations come out, but how these might evolve? How the plan might change.
See, that I actually do have a better answer for. Okay. If you do take a look at the regs and it's under definitions, the term fully vaccinated, the wording that's on there is talking about the worker has received the recommended number of doses, not one, not two, but the recommended number. So if there is going to be a requirement for a booster or something to that effect, this would be incorporated into that. So these regs do contemplate that there could be a further requirement. There isn't today. The recommended number is 2. I don't think we have Johnson here with the 1 shot, but the recommended dose is 2. So 2 weeks past that. So that's what the section talks about.
Okay, thanks. Question here about the role of a prime contractor. So as a prime contractor, can we ask for proof of vaccination or negative test from our sub-trades on specific work sites? And this is a really relevant question for construction. And I want to come back to, after this, to the point about this being at the employer's discretion, because that's only true if you're in charge of the site, right? And sometimes it's really not your decision as an employer, because, and it really ties into this question of the person higher up the chain saying, we're going to require this. So maybe we'll just ask that question. Can owners of sites or the prime contractors on a site require that these regulations be applicable to anybody working on their site?
See, nobody wants to take that one. My interpretation would be yes, and I draw a few parallels to advice that I give to other clients. So you as an organization may or may not have a policy, but if you're operating in a facility that does, you are required to observe the policy that is in place for that facility. So that's the advice that I would give to clients in a wide realm of operations.
Thanks, Ken. Here's a question from Dan. Since we know that the virus is carried and transmitted by everybody, wouldn't it be better to request testing of all individuals so unvaccinated employees aren't singled out and potentially discriminated against, thereby retaining confidentiality? Because isn't the point to identify positive positive individuals? I mean, that's probably a question for the health professionals, but anybody have any thoughts on why we're not just testing everybody?
It is a bit of a clinical question, Mark. So unfortunately, we don't have a representative from the Ministry of Health on here, but I would just say that, you know, part of the point of these vaccination requirements is to increase the level of vaccination in the province and thereby decrease the number of hospitalizations that our healthcare system is currently experiencing. It's not to make it easy or comfortable for people to choose the testing option. The testing option is there, but the purpose is not to make it easy for people choosing that. The purpose is to apply some pressure and encourage more people to become fully vaccinated.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Okay, a few questions here about oh wait, where did that go? No, where did the question go? Just a second, it bounced around on me. There we go. So what if, here's a question from Amy. What if the employer does not give an option for testing as an alternative? Are there legal rights for the employee then? So if they don't give an off-ramp?
I'll jump in quickly on this one. And what I will say is the regulations as a protective net were created with an off-ramp, that being testing as an option. So again, if you're going to choose to do something outside of these regulations, I don't think you have necessarily the same protection. Because again, that's how they were designed. But does that mean it's you can or can't do it? Well, you can do a whole bunch of other things if you choose to. You're not going to have that same level, but that's where you'd want to have a conversation with your HR and your legal counsel to say what can and can't we do.
Well, it kind of comes back to the point you made at the very start, Candice, right? Which is you wouldn't recommend that an employer do that for exactly that reason, right?
Right, that's exactly it. And I think, Mark, it ties into one of the sort of prep questions you had sent us, which is, you know, is there any precedent on this yet? And the answer largely across the board is no. So for an employee who is in that situation where the employer has mandated vaccines, no off-ramp, you know, we don't know where that lands yet. As you can imagine, all of these policies having been introduced in, say, the last 6 months, speaking generously, they just haven't had the time to wind their way through the courts yet. And so we don't know what the result is going to be if somebody is, for example, terminated for failing to comply with that sort of policy. I would certainly encourage an employer to get legal counsel before implementing that kind of policy. And I would encourage an employee who doesn't want to comply with that kind of policy to seek out legal counsel as well. Legal counsel and HR advice as well. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of clarity to offer on that either, but it's definitely a live issue.
Thank you. If you get to so here's a question from an employer perspective. If you get to a point with an employee that won't get the vaccination and you have no sites available to send anybody who's unvaccinated and those sites won't accept tests, which we are seeing, and we need to lay off without notice, do we have to pay for lack of notice, or how do we fill out their record of employment or is it a layoff? Are they noted as quitting? Is it firing? So some of the procedural questions around when you have run through the remedies that are available to you as an employer, what do you do then?
So as far as I know, there's still, obviously, depending how long the person has been employed with that business, they still have, the business has an obligation to provide pay or pay in lieu of notice. As far as what you would put on the ROE, that's a tough one. It could be, I don't know, there's a few options running through my head of like job abandonment or quit or a termination for cause. One thing that it would depend on is if the company actually has a policy on that. Then it could be considered a termination. And if it is cut and dry in that policy that the person is refusing to get vaccinated and refusing to get a test, then I would assume that would be grounds for termination based on, not following the black and white policy.
Right. So you're kind of in an interesting situation as an employer here, and there's lots of questions in the chat and the Q&A about the reality of construction, which is that we do work for other people, right? And so sometimes these decisions are outside of the hands of an employer. As I understand the regulations, they require a positive action by an employer to say, yes, we're gonna follow these regulations so that therefore we can avail ourselves of the protection they provide. But that means we have to have a policy, we have to notify people, we have to go through that process. So there's a positive action required by the employer in that case. And a starting point, Rodelle, to what you're saying is, if you're going to take these actions as a company, or you're going to do it, right, whether because others are requiring it of you or because you're choosing to do it, you need to make sure you've got the policy framework in place and that you've checked that and confirmed that it's in compliance, and that gives you then the ability to take the steps that are necessary in terms of your human resources management. And so that's kind of a minimum starting point. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I really do think. So let's use a situation where you've got a site owner who has the requirement. We've determined, at least in this conversation, we think that that's valid and that they can do that for people to access their site. A company doesn't have its own policy in place, but the company doing the hiring does, the hiring of all of the firms. What do you do in that case? Are we basically in a situation, candidly, where everybody better get a policy on this because you're going to be forced to one way or the other? So let me ask that, and then I've got a whole bunch of other questions.
That would generally be my recommendation for those who are in a position where the qualifications or the status of their workforce can be essentially dictated by someone else. I think the least risky option for an employer in that situation is to put in a policy that falls within the regulations, so that to the extent that they have individuals who cannot be on a work site, they can fall back on that policy and say you're not in compliance with the policy. Otherwise, I think the employer is very much in a gray area in terms of what they can or cannot do with that person's employment.
Rodelle, would you agree with that? Yeah, okay. So I think we've answered this question. I'm just going to read through it, but I think we've covered it off. And if anybody has anything they want to add to it, they can. As a subtrade, we have a number of owners and GCs who are mandating double vaccination to access their site. So that's the common theme running here for construction as a service industry. What do we do as an employer with employees who will not vaccinate or refuse to share their status? Do we lay them off? Technically, it's not a shortage of work. We're desperate for skilled labor. And I want to come back to that question, which is one of the questions I asked you in the prep is, what do you do with an industry that's struggling to find people right now? But anything we want to add to the question of what we do as an employer with employees who will not vaccinate or refuse to share vaccination status? I think we've covered that off, but does anybody want to add anything to that?
One piece I'd just add to that is for those who have a policy that talks about vaccinate or test, so then you clearly have that off ramp. You have an ability for anyone to comply should they choose to do so. In my mind, an employee who's not complying with either of those options needs to be subject to your discipline policy. And ideally, you've got that in writing as well. But anytime we're talking about a breach of an employment policy, whether it's COVID related or completely unrelated, what we want to see from an employment perspective is sort of that process of progressive discipline. And in a case like this, it's not going to be possible to start out with, say, a written warning onto, a verbal warning onto a written warning. But I think it's a best practice for employers to start with a relatively brief period where the employee is going to be asked to remain away from the workplace until they comply. Assuming, say you say, well, you're on a 1 week suspension, come back in a week, give me your test. If they still don't comply, I think it's a longer suspension. And probably on the third failure to comply, at that point, you're starting to look at termination. But I think it's really important for employers to follow that process and not just automatically proceed to a termination for someone who hasn't complied with the policy.
Thank you. Okay, a question bounced around on me again here. So well, you know what, actually, before I get to that, I want to ask about the labor shortage question. And Clint, I'm going to ask you to put your ICT hat on here. Because when you're not swamped with these things, that's part of your focus, right? Is how do you make sure that that Saskatchewan has the people that it needs and the workforce that it needs. Construction is in a labor shortage right now, which we're all anticipating is only going to get worse as we see the demand for construction. Even if a small percentage of the workforce is affected by this and is basically taken out of like even 2-3%, or even likely to be a little higher, but even if it's a small percent, that still has an impact in an industry right now that doesn't have people. And I know we're not the only ones, restaurants or others, right? The hospitality industry, I'm sure you're hearing from them all the time on this. So what are the thoughts in terms of what can be done there, and how as an industry and as a province, we can respond to the labor shortage while we're also making it harder maybe for people to be in the workforce?
No, I completely get that point for sure. We've been meeting with different groups, and of course, the many associations that construction likes to deal with. We've had a number of reach outs to us on this very topic. We get it. It is a tough environment, and do these regulations make it more difficult to attract? Potentially. I mean, this is in fact one of the reasons why this is optional. You're going to have to make choices as an employer as you're working with your labor shortage, which we know there is right now. In terms of what are we doing about that on a go-forward basis, we are doing the outreach pieces. We are reaching out to our career services locations around the province, and we let folks know who are eligible to be employed through various aspects. We bring up our job postings. We do bring that up on a regular basis, of which you guys obviously put a number on our SAS Jobs website and others. We let people know that there's a future here. We've engaged in looking at expanding some of the training opportunities, our skills and trade centers, our apprenticeship model. So we've been looking at what can we do to expand capacity to get more of our tradespeople ready to go, skilled up and certified to do the work. The other thing that I would point to is we are meeting with our post-secondaries, as I mentioned, to do something similar. What do we need? And I know that this isn't a 2-year away problem. This is a today issue. This is medium term, and this is long term. So what are we doing to increase capacity? So we are reaching out to our training institutions. The other thing that we are taking a look at is pursuing the immigration pathway. What can we do to get people fast-tracked with the skilled shortage that we have right now? So we are working with the feds right now to provide a quicker stream. And of course, there's a negotiation that happens every time you deal with that. But those are the areas we're pursuing. So both from a retail perspective of people who are coming into our career service centers, we're trying to direct them to the amazing work opportunities that you guys are providing. We are talking to our post-secondary and our skills training to make sure that we're increasing number of seats and capacity. And we are looking outside our borders to try to enhance what immigration can do on this front as well. Again, I get the conflict here where yes, we have a shortage, and you as a province are potentially making it more difficult to recruit. I understand that too, but again, this is where the trade-off happens between the health and safety of the people in the province, making sure our health system continues to run while ensuring our economy continues to move along. And we've seen a lot of growth in this area, especially. So I don't think I have a perfect answer, but those are the things that we are doing.
So I have two follow-up questions on that before we move back into the specific COVID questions. immigration seems like a necessary path to be able to bring skilled labor because you can't, train a journey person overnight. But how complicated is that with COVID right now? Like how have the immigration pathways become more challenging because of that? I mean, I'm sure the answer is yes to that, but how is immigration navigating that?
Yeah, no, it's a good observation for sure. So because we don't run the immigration system independently as a province, it's a shared responsibility with the federal government. Unfortunately, we have seen processing times increase. That is just the reality. Again, when you're looking at, is the border open, closed? Can you get people here in a timely fashion? We've seen the wait times increase. That is something that we continually work with our federal counterparts on to let them know that this is impacting business. This impacts the economy of Saskatchewan, and can we get some of these processing times quicker? Are people still coming here and landing? Yes, they are. It does take a little bit longer. We are constantly processing the job approval letters and as well as the SINP applications. So we're trying to push on our side to try to expedite as much as we can. Obviously, we have competing interests as a government as well, but we know that it's slowed down, and it's something that we'll continue to work on. I know that's not a great answer for you, but it's what we can do at this point.
No, that's good. And so last question on this topic, I think, is if you're an employer and you're struggling to find the people that you need, I mean, and I'm sure you would say this too, Clint, I'd always encourage people to reach out to their industry association to raise awareness about this. But, who should they be talking to in the government? Do they just, like everybody else, call Ken and tell him their problems, or who should they be talking to?
Yeah, Ken has now set up his own 900 number where you can get his information. No, that would be a conflict of interest. Absolutely reach out to Immigration and Career Training. And if you are looking and you have a labor shortage, we have two separate groups that we would cycle you through depending on what you're looking for. So we have our employer services group, which is probably where I would suggest you start. They get in and try to understand what it is you're dealing with and who you're looking for. They would then bring in our immigration folks, because again, our preference would be, let's get our domestic people employed as quickly as we possibly can. That's going to be the quickest thing for you as well. But sometimes that doesn't always work. I've posted a job a lot. I'm not getting applicants. I'm not getting anybody. What else can we do? So if I was to make a suggestion, I would call our employer services group first.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, now back to vaccination related questions. So we have a couple of questions both in the chat and the Q&A about sample or example wordings or policies that employers can use. Any resources that anybody knows of or can point to as a good starting point for a company that wants to adopt a policy in compliance with the regulations? First of all, does the ministry have anything like that, or Candice and Rodelle, do you know of anything?
No, we don't have a template per se when it comes to implementing the employer's COVID-19 emergency regulations. So that isn't there. There's some materials on the website, including a fact sheet and some Q&As, but that probably doesn't help go very far in terms of actually forming the words that would make up the policy. So our guidance would at this point would be to be consistent with what's in the regulations. But I don't know if Candice and Rodelle have anything else to offer on that.
Yeah, I haven't seen any like templates per se. When it comes to just like your policy in general, again, outlining the purpose of it. What do you count as proof for either vaccination or a negative test? How will you keep people's information secure? Who has access to that information? Those are kind of some headings or touch points anyway.
Yeah, similarly, I haven't seen anything by way of a template or anything like that. Rodelle's suggestions for how to develop your own policy are excellent ones. We've seen kind of a few variations of homegrown policies, and most of them actually have been quite good. So I assume they've been kind of developed in accordance with some of those guidelines. But to the extent that people are trying to draft these themselves, consulting with your legal team or your HR consultant is obviously a good idea. I think somebody mentioned in the chat that it's important to do that to make sure you're not offside any other laws. Again, Rodelle has given you some excellent tips on how to start.
Good. And I will commit to circling back with my association colleagues about what we can do to put something like that together as a potential resource. And I will point out that my colleague Kevin Dueck at the Regina Construction Association and his team during the first wave of the pandemic put together a good number of policies and resources like that, and they may have something in the works already on this. So we'll see what's out there and make sure that we can provide options for members and other companies to consider. Okay, so a few questions both in the chat and the Q&A around whether or not a policy has to be consistent. So if you're an employer and you have field employees and shop employees or office employees, do you have to have the same policy for all employees? You know, is it a problem if you don't? And what does that look like?
Sure, I can start, but I'd probably defer to our legal experts on here. I think my general advice would be to apply a policy evenly throughout the workplace, but perhaps our legal experts have a view on this.
Well, it's interesting because I was very keen to hear the government's position on this. My strict reading of the regulations says that the employer may require all of its workers to comply with one of the options. So as I'm reading the regulations, at least currently, I would say you must apply your policy in the same manner with respect to all of your employees.
That would have been my read of it as well when we were designing this, and some of the things that were contemplated wasn't all, hence the language choice on that front. So if you want to deviate from what's written, if you want to do a sort of chunked out component, I'm going to say your risk does increase after that.
Okay, thank you. Just going through the questions here. Sorry, I'm just going back to the top. Okay, so one here from Ron. As a builder contractor, do we have responsibility to inform trades that certain individuals that are also working on site have not been vaccinated if we know? Is that a requirement? I would guess that it's the opposite, that that's probably not a good idea to share that information and it's not required, but can somebody clarify that?
I don't see that as a requirement, no.
A question both in the chat and in the Q&A, is a company allowed to put in place a policy that all new hires must be vaccinated or the company will not hire them?
Well, that's an interesting one. It's one, I think when we're speaking about the legal perspective, we're always talking about managing your risk. And from a legal perspective, when you're in that hiring process, you're going to make all kinds of distinctions about who you hire and who you don't. You may say having a certain amount of experience is a requirement, and you may refuse to hire people who don't meet that requirement. And I mean, just on a very basic definition, that is discriminating, that is choosing between two people. And as we talked about earlier, the Human Rights Code only protects certain grounds in terms of discrimination. So it is illegal, of course, not to hire someone because they suffer from a disability, unless there's certain bona fide occupational requirements that flow from that. To date, somebody who is not vaccinated for reasons that are not associated with the human rights ground, that's not protected by any of the laws that we've seen. So hypothetically, I think you could potentially refuse to hire individuals who aren't vaccinated, but to the extent that that is different than what the regulations provide, you increase your risk by doing so. And so I think that may be one of those areas where an employee or an employer looking at making that sort of a mandatory requirement may want to delve into it a little bit deeper with their own professional team.
Okay, so I have two questions here from Amber, both of which have been echoed in a few different places. So the first is, our customer requires us as a subcontractor to send employees to site that are fully vaccinated or provide negative tests. So we've talked about this example already. the customer has put it on us as the contractor to collect this information and verify. So are we allowed to confidentially collect proof of negative tests or proof of vaccination? And there's two parts to this that I want to add to Amber's question. So I understand that this week, perhaps even today, the commercial crowns in Saskatchewan are going to announce policies requiring all of their contractors and everyone on their sites to be vaccinated, and so or comply with the testing. Details still to be announced, but Clint, I can see you nodding, so that is must in fact be coming, which I thought. So that requirement is going to apply even more broadly than it does today. So doesn't in order for an employer, and the Crown requirement is going to be that they're not going to collect that information. They're going to require the employers to do that and to attest that it is in fact that everybody working on the site meets the requirements. So does an employer have to have a policy in place in order to collect this information, and a policy in place in compliance with the regulations, or can they do it without having a policy in place is I think the question. Go ahead, Rodelle.
I would say you would want a policy in place as an employer, just to help outline some of this framework, and when you're implementing something like that's new, kind of back to that question at the beginning about people feeling anxious and just disgruntled, having a policy helps ground everyone in that people aren't being treated differently, that this is a policy for the company as a whole.
Okay, anybody has anything to add to that? Okay, Clint, so can you share a little bit, I just got a question, the person hadn't heard what I said about the new mandate, so can you share what you're able to share about what we're going to hear from the Crowns?
Sure. So what we are looking at as the executive government and the Crowns is, because the question came up for us was, well, because the question was really more around more of an IT nature, where we have people who are not our employees, but they've been on contract and you would never know they weren't employees of government. They've been here for so long and they work shoulder to shoulder with us. We're going to be taking a position that they are going to be required proof of vaccination or a negative test to be that contract employee on the grounds working shoulder to shoulder. We aren't looking at if you're coming in to change one of the fluorescent lights in my office. That's a different situation. It's more employee light type of a scenario where you're going to be coming in and working with the team directly. Then you will be required to show POV or negative test. There's going to be more information on that coming out, I suspect, this week about what that final position is going to be, but that's sort of the spirit of what we're going to be going after.
Okay, thank you. So the other question that Amber had and that had been asked in a number of places was around, we sort of talked about this, but I don't know that we got a definitive answer. Is somebody quitting, or are they being laid off if they refuse to comply? So if there's a policy in place and whether they refuse to get vaccinated or show they're vaccinated and they refuse to test, then clearly they can't work. There's no work for them. Are they being terminated? Are they being laid off? Are they quitting? How does an employer handle that? Has there been any guidance provided on that?
I don't know that there's been any guidance provided on that. I think, at least in my mind, when I think about this theoretically, I think there may be two different scenarios to talk through. The first one being an employer that doesn't have a policy itself, but where clients or other contractors they're working with are saying, your employees need to comply with these requirements. I think in that case, it's probably a layoff, because although it's not a shortage of work overall, it's a shortage of work that person is qualified to do. I think that's the best I can get to on that hypothetical. In the other scenario where the employer has the policy itself and the individual will not comply with that policy, then I think, subject to that process that we had talked about earlier, where you give the employee clear notice that they are going to have to comply and time to do that, I think in that case, it's a with cause termination. I'd be very interested to hear what Rodelle and others think about that.
Yeah, my thoughts too were, it's just like, I mean, assuming, say you have a policy that everyone has to wear a hard hat on site, it's just like if you have a policy for mandatory vaccinations or negative tests, and if someone's choosing not to wear their hard hat on site, there's progressive discipline you go through, and in the end results in termination. The person might get frustrated in the meantime and say, I quit, I don't want to deal with this. But same thing with the vaccine and negative test policy. That makes it, you go through the progressive discipline, which is a little limited, like Candice had mentioned. You're not going to give a written warning and still allow them to come to work and then continue down that road. So it could be like a week suspension or something. And if they're still not compliant at the end of the day, they're being terminated because they're not following the company's policy.
Interesting. So potentially a layoff because there's no work that they can do, right? Because they're not out there, because they are not following the rules, but also potentially termination because they're in violation of the policy. So we don't really have a good answer, right? Which is, and that really sucks for employers, and I think everybody gets that. I mean, everybody being involved in this world. So if that's the reality, which is not a good reality, but a reality that everybody is going to face here, how do they navigate that? Like, what do? Do they just call Candice or Rodelle or Ken and ask for help and guidance on this? Because that's a tough decision to make. We're talking here about long-term relationships sometimes that they've had with employees and things like that, right? And also in the time when you need people to do work and there aren't a lot of surplus people. So it's everybody's anxiety and anger levels are at like all-time highs. So probably all of us, right? I myself have worked through multiple stress balls over the last few months. So I know I'm just rambling, but I guess the question is, if there is no clear answer to whether somebody is fired or laid off, what do you do?
I don't know that any of us have a great answer to that. I think the best thing you can do is use the resources that are at your disposal. And so, Mark, I don't want to put more on your plate, but I'd encourage members to call you. Hopefully, if there's been a clear development in the law, people like myself from Rodelle and Clint and Ken will all have been in contact to say, we have some clarification. Here's what you need to do in these circumstances. But until then, I think the best you can do is act in good faith with good intentions and try to work through these issues as they come, because it's 1:19 on October 4th. Now we can tell you right now that there's no answer, but the individuals on this call are certainly not the only people dealing with these issues, and we do expect there will be clarity at some point as we move through these sorts of issues.
Maybe that is a sort of Rodelle. I see you me to talk. Come to you in a second, Ken, too. Maybe this is a conversation to the point of people who aren't on this call. These are conversations we need to be having with labor relations and workplace safety, probably too, right? And I'm sure they're already hearing about it and navigating it and trying to figure it out. But clarity, as much as possible, clarity creates stability and certainty for people, right? And in a time when that is not in high supply, it's nice to have that. Ken and then Rodelle.
And just a bit of a comment, I think that both Candice and Rodelle have talked about, processes to provide your business with more certainty. So while there might not be a black and white answer, there are options that you can reduce your risk by having policies in place and procedures in place that you're going to follow. So certainly reduces your risk. Every human resources issue has individual aspects to it that you have to go through, and so each situation is unique. But if you have solid policies and processes in place, that will serve you well and de-risk the situation for you.
Thanks, Ken. Rodelle, did you want to?
No, Candice had covered it when I was, yeah.
Thanks. So if an employee, this is a question from Robin. We have about 45 questions or so in the Q&A and 39 minutes. So we'll do rapid fire, one word answers, or no, I'm kidding. We'll go through as many questions as we can. We probably won't get to everything today, but we'll endeavor to get answers from two people's questions as we can. So question from Robin: if an employer does not put in a policy regarding proof of vaccination or negative test, what are the possible legal ramifications if there's an outbreak at a work site? So, this is the other side. If they choose not to do it and there is an outbreak, does that leave them more exposed perhaps to risk than otherwise? Candice?
Sure. Just on a practical level, I'm not sure that it changes much. To the extent that you've got an outbreak in your workplace, there's going to be processes and protocols to follow, regardless of whether there's a policy in place. The hope, I think, is that by introducing a policy, you're less likely to have an outbreak in the first place. But I'm not sure that it changes anything process or liability wise.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, just scrolling through here. Okay, our construction business, this is from Janice. Our construction business has rapid tests obtained through the government/pharmacy to screen our unvaxxed employees. This is sufficient for our own use, but can it be used for job sites? Question mark. If the job site wants proof of a negative site or a negative test, will the employee have to get a test at another facility and get a printed proof?
I think I'd comment with what Ken has been indicating is where you're going to somebody else's job site. I think it would be wise to abide by their specifications.
Okay, anybody have anything to add to that? I saw a question here that from Lonnie McKenzie that I've got to find now because it's moved on me, but there it is. And it was a question that I had flagged, I think, as a pre-question is, under the OH&S rules, there's a provision for employees to be able to refuse unusually dangerous work. And some may take the view that the vaccination itself is unusually dangerous. Is that a valid reason for people to refuse to take the vaccine? And how does an employer deal with this approach?
So I think we've actually seen this question on both sides. We've seen individuals who say, I won't take the vaccine because it's unsafe. And we've also seen individuals saying, I won't work next to somebody who's not vaccinated because it's unsafe. I'm not sure that it's our place to say whether either of those are accurate, but to say that there are processes in place where an employee can refuse that work if they feel that it's unsafe. And then, of course, it's adjudicated by the local occupational health and safety committee and ultimately by the provincial division if there's no resolution there.
I was sort of expecting this one to come up, and I did check with labor relations. Earlier on in the pandemic, there was some different claims that the WorkSafe is not a safe workplace because I'm with unvaccinated people. That did not hold up. Right now, that does not constitute what is defined as unusually dangerous, which is the language in the regs. So that does not, at this point in time, without it being tested further, the interpretation is that whether you're with or surrounded by unvaccinated people is not a quote unquote unusually dangerous. So it doesn't meet that definition.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've talked about this one already. If an employer requires weekly COVID tests for the non-vaccinated worker, is the employer responsible to pay for the test in time? So just to clarify what the rules say today, and there are two sets of regulations, one for the public sector, so public employers, and one for private employers. The public sector employer regulation says that the employees are responsible for the cost of the test. And I believe that the private sector regulations are silent on that, right? Which means that it is up to the employer to determine whether they want to pay for the test or require the employee to pay for the test. If they require, so see everybody nodding, so I'm going to assume that what I said was correct, which is a nice change for me. So if the employer says, we're not going to pay for it, so we're going to require the employee to pay for it, do the regulations allow for them to do that?
Yeah, the default under the regulations is that the employee pays for the test unless the employer agrees to take on the obligation.
Thank you. Why were rapid tests removed as an approved testing option? That's going to have to be one of Clint. Okay, there we go. Go ahead, Ken.
I guess it depends on for what purpose. I got this question a fair bit on a SUMA town hall I was just on before this. And so the rapid tests are not being viewed as acceptable for things like patronage at certain non-essential places like theaters and bars and restaurants and taverns. And it's not being viewed as an acceptable form of testing for Government of Saskatchewan employees. But rapid tests are still an effective way to do additional screening in workplaces. And to my reading of the regulations for private sector employers, you could choose to use rapid testing as a viable alternative. If you're doing that on a regular basis and that's your form of proof of testing, that perhaps you procured either through the Saskatchewan Health Authority or through Health Canada, could be an effective screening tool for the workplace.
Okay, thank you. A question that was asked a little while ago, and I've been meaning to get back to it and kept moving on me in the Q&A was, and this is more of a general one, but it's regarding a duty to accommodate. So is there not a duty to accommodate here for employers in situations like this where okay, you've got somebody, you can't send them to a site, but you can maybe keep them busy with office work? Is an employer in a position where this is something that they have to try and accommodate? So long as somebody is in compliance with the test. So if they're getting their testing or whatever the case might be, even if the job site won't accept that, does the employer have a responsibility to accommodate?
Generally speaking, the answer is no. The duty to accommodate is a phrase that we typically see used in the human rights context. So again, we're back to those prohibited grounds. If you had, for example, a work site that said everybody must be fully vaccinated, full stop, and you had somebody who for medical or religious reasons did not become vaccinated, as an employer, you would have to accommodate that to the point of undue hardship. To the extent that it is a personal decision not to become vaccinated, or to the extent that there is that off-ramp to provide tests instead, those are not things that need to be accommodated.
Okay. The question here about requiring employees to pay for tests. So if we have employees that are not vaxxed and choose to do the testing, is there something in place to help them pay for the tests? I hear they can be $95 per test, and I've heard they can be higher than that. And so I know that from the government, with public employees, there's absolutely no question that the employees have to pay for it. And I've heard from ministers that there is no intention to put any financial support behind paying for these kinds of testing. But can you confirm that for me, Ken or Clint?
Yeah, you've got that right, Mark. It is required for public sector employees to pay for it themselves. And the reason for that is that we're not trying to make that option easy for folks. We are trying to encourage people to get vaccinated, and that's free. Getting vaccinated is free, and you can do that at any time at this point. And so that's one of the reasons for not making it or putting taxpayer dollars into it, as Clint said earlier. That being said, if a private business chose to do that for its employees, that would be, to my mind, permissible under the regulations, if I have that right, Clint. So if, as an employer, you chose to do that, you could. But keeping in mind that the public policy purpose of this is really to encourage more people to get vaccinated and to get us closer to that 90% number of that's really going to relieve pressure on our hospitals and our healthcare system.
Okay, thank you. Question here from Mary. If you create a policy that employees must be vaccinated or show a negative test, then do you have to automatically apply this policy to any subcontractors?
I don't think you have to automatically apply it. I don't see much risk in doing so.
Right. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so the next one is, and there's a couple of different questions in here about this one worded in different ways, but how do we ensure we're protecting medical records of employees when passing this information on to other people on the site? So if your subcontractor and your general contractor requires it, and they're actually asking for the proof of vaccination or the negative test results themselves, yeah, what happens with the sharing of medical information and the protection of that?
I would say it's the same as anything else. Is you do want to be clear on your policy who has access to that information. You don't want to require more than you absolutely need to disclose. So if it is a list of employees with a tick box beside it, that would be fair. Making sure you have a handle on who has access to that information, how it's stored, when are records destroyed. Having a policy around that would probably be your best defense.
Okay, any additional thoughts on that? Jessica has a question that she'd asked previously in the chat and has in the Q&A as well, but do you need to do a workplace hazard assessment first? You know, to basically, do you have to do that first to determine and provide some verification that a vaccine or testing mandate is required?
Clint and I unmuted it exactly.
No, you go ahead. You sound much smarter than I do today.
Oh, well, that one I think is an easy one. You don't need to do that beforehand.
Right. There's no requirement to do that, right? And that's what the regulations have provided the room for. So, okay. Okay, we've answered that one. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Okay. So a question from Lawrence here, can a client require full vaccination for all subcontractors or suppliers, while for their employees just requiring full vaccination or testing? So can they have a different rule? And we're seeing some of this, at least I've heard about it anecdotally in the industrial sector. I haven't seen any direct evidence of it myself, where there isn't an accommodation for contractors, right? It's a vaccination only requirement. So is that legal? Maybe is probably the answer, which I know nobody wants to hear, but who can comment on that?
I'd go a step further than maybe and say probably it's legal. The relationship between companies and their subcontractors is not nearly as highly regulated as the relationship between employers and their employees. So I think it's fair to push back on that kind of requirement and say, well, legally, all we can require is that people either provide confirmation of vaccination or a negative test. And so it's going to be impossible for us to staff this job if that's the requirement. I appreciate that does absolutely nothing for those who are facing a shortage of employees, but I don't think it would be illegal under the contract for them to put that sort of requirement in.
Okay, thanks. So here's a question about recommended means for verifying vaccination. So the question is, what is the recommended means to verify an employee is vaccinated? Should we be asking to see their valid proof of vaccination, say the QR code or the COVID Vax card, or is a signed declaration stating their status sufficient? So maybe Clint, how are you guys doing it?
You're starting to know how I answer questions now. I'll tell you what we're doing is on our website for all public servants. It's a website where you go in and self-declare. Given a period of time after that, it is the responsibility of the manager or the direct supervisor to go and take a look and verify that proof of vaccination. And of course, there's a few of those that you can actually provide. Your QR code, your wallet thing that you can download now, your little card. And then we have a thing that just says, yes, I have verified, and that's the end of it. We're not retaining that information. Aside from the little tick box, we're not taking pictures of your proof of vaccination. It is just at the manager's discretion on that. So that's how we're staying away from the privacy impact. We look at it, we verify it, that's the end of it. So one and done for us.
Okay, thank you. And so you're not collecting that information, and that's probably where a lot of this is going to have to go, right? Is that it's yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this gets implemented. So here's a question from an anonymous attendee. If an employee is able to provide proof of vaccination, so basically if you're required to provide proof of vaccination or required to provide a negative test, how does that not create some kind of forced or coerced disclosure of personal information? And is the short answer that in the normal circumstances it might, but this isn't a normal circumstance, and that's why we have these emergency regulations? Yeah. Okay. So we're basically, we've created the legal framework to enable this because it wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Okay. Okay, so this one we've touched on this, but I'm going to ask it again anyway because it's a good question. So if an employee is required to be vaccinated to go on a job site, but the person does not have a vaccine, can we send the employee home without pay and they can be on leave until the employer has work for them? So this would be a layoff scenario.
I would say again, if there is a policy, it would go back to what your policy states. So when it comes to progressive discipline, companies might have like say a 5-step process. It could be like a coaching report, then a verbal warning, then a written warning, then suspension. And that suspension one would say if it's unpaid or unpaid leave. For my experience, majority of like private companies anyway is unpaid. There's no like legal requirement that you have to pay someone while they're on a suspension.
Okay, thank you. Question from Chris here. When we have to send somebody to a work camp and vaccines will be mandatory as of November 1st, how do we approach that? So they basically got, a little less than a month to just asking for best advice for the company. And the question is, do we just have an in-house testing or vaccine policy? Is that the place to start? I mean, I know we've said policy is the place to start, but any other advice for somebody who's staring down, 26 days before they have to comply?
Yeah, I think policy is the best option, given that timeline to get on that very quickly and start working through, even just to get that benchmark in terms of, do we have half of our staff, 3/4 of our staff, where are we at in terms of those vaccinations, and make sure that we have appropriate measures in place to be able to check tests and those sorts of things. But definitely I would recommend a policy that brings that employer within the regulations.
This is a question that might even be better posed to some of the other members of our COVID response team, because it deals more with contract risk and construction law. But if a vaccine policy is implemented by a customer midway through a contract, which will be common right now, and imposed on all of the contractors, and the contract doesn't specifically address this issue, which it likely doesn't, are you able to, does the contractor have any mechanism for applying for extras to cover off testing costs or the additional expenses that are involved in providing this kind of information? So any feedback on that in terms of how you can handle that as a contractor if all of a sudden the contractual terms you've agreed to have changed? We need to call Misty, Candice. That was yeah. Okay.
Yes, so I would certainly send anybody with that question Misty's way. And then, I think there'll be some general principles about whether you can amend contracts midway and what that looks like, but certainly outside of my area of expertise.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that it's a good question. There will be some of these questions that, they've been great information for us that we will then take and working with our partner associations, see what we can do to come up with some resources. For instance, one here from Trent, it's asking if the Saskatchewan Construction Safety Association can check the policies to see if they're worded correctly. I'm not going to speak for my colleague Colin or his team on that, but I think as associations, we can certainly have a conversation about what kind of resources we can, template resources we can provide to members and what we can do to support you through that. So we will all commit to having those conversations, as I've said, with my colleagues and see what we can get to. A question here from Babineau is, how do you handle a fraudulent vaccination card? So, I mean, is there training going on in government to train people to look for what is, fraudulent versus not fraudulent proof of vaccination? What's happening on that, and how do you handle somebody passing off or trying to pass off a fraudulent vaccination?
I can take a crack at that one, Mark. So there's obviously going to be some people that are going to try and get around the system by creating fraudulent proof of vaccination. And there isn't necessarily training or a guide specifically around that, but you probably all saw that in the news late last week. We had an MLA who lied about her vaccination status and chose to resign from caucus. So, I think that if somebody's choosing to lie and you're quite certain of that, you can ask for another form of verification if you're thinking that form is fraudulent, and pursue it in that direction. But there isn't a specific training piece around that.
Okay, thanks, Ken. So here's a question from Tom Redhead. We have a PVNT policy. I don't know what PVNT stands for, so I apologize. I don't, maybe somebody else does, but we have a PVNT policy now, and our customers do. We're a service company. How can I inform so I'm assuming it's related to this area, but how can I inform my scheduling staff who they can or can't send to certain customers without affecting my employees' privacy rights in terms of their medical records? So this is a procedural question. Rodelle, I'm going to ask you to weigh in first here about, in a situation where some clients might be accepting it and others might not, and you're going to keep people working. How does an employer navigate that piece, especially when you've got somebody else handling the scheduling? And
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one, because it's not every company is, small and the owner is sending people out to jobs. For that one, I don't know, maybe it's first of all, a conversation with that scheduler, explaining the confidentiality around this and that it's supposed to be confidential. Hoping the company also has a confidentiality policy. Practically speaking, I'm thinking like an Excel spreadsheet, like a matrix or something of just like the person's name and like a tick box if they're good to go to site. I don't know. Candice, looking for your thoughts as well.
Yeah, my comments are similar. I mean, I take some guidance from the various reports from the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Saskatchewan. And their general principle has been private information can be shared as long as there's that need to know basis. And so I would think in these circumstances, your scheduler needs to know who can go to which work site. They don't need to know that that's because of vaccination status. They don't really need to know much more than, Jim can work on client A, but not client B. And that could be for any number of reasons. So I would keep the disclosure to the scheduler as narrow as possible. And I would, as Rodelle has suggested, make sure that that person is aware that that is confidential information, even if it's not tied directly to the medical information.
So building off of that, there's a question here from Maggie Kelly, and we've talked a little bit about this, and there's been a handful of questions around it about that have been in the chat and Q&A about the sharing of vaccination information with partners, right? So again, anybody up the supply chain or client who wants to know. Now, I suspect that where we're going to end up is that the best practice for these companies is going to be, we don't actually want to know. We just want you to, we want to know that you have accepted the risk and that you're in compliance with these rules. And so you verify for us that that's the case, and we don't want to see anybody's proof of anything, right? But so then it's on the employer, and that's probably the best practice for the employer too, so that information never gets shared outside of the company. But absent that, if a client is saying, no, we want to know that everybody has been vaccinated or has test results, do the regulations allow for that? And is an employer protected if they're sharing that information? Do they have to disclose to the employee that that information is being shared? Thoughts on sort of that universe of questions?
I'll take a first crack at this. I guess the first thing is, again, make sure you have a documented policy, letting the employee know if this information is going to be shared and what you're sharing. So again, I would suggest keep it to a minimum. Again, when you take a look at the QR verifier thing, I would say that's a pretty good indicator of where we would prefer you to go with this. Less is more. So for those of you who haven't downloaded the little app, scans your QR. All it says is Clint Repski is fully vaccinated, green box, red box. It's not my date of birth. It's not my doses and dates. All it says is green light, red light. So if that's any indication, I think the less that you're going to be sharing would be preferential. And of course, disclosing to the employee that, no, I'll hand out this piece of paper with a tick box beside your name that we have verified that would probably be fairly appropriate in this case.
Okay, anything that anybody'd like to add to that?
Well, that's certainly the easiest from a privacy perspective, but I do understand that from a logistics standpoint, it may make some sense to collect information in a different way. And our legal experts can weigh in, but I think they already kind of have, in terms of making sure that you're telling people why you're collecting the information, who you're collecting it, or what you're going to do with it, who's going to have access to it, and how long you're keeping it, and how you're keeping that information safe. And if you kind of follow along with those things, I think there's ways that you can use that information effectively. So
a good policy really needs to address those items to provide clarity for the employee and the employer, right? When a workplace breaks, so there was a couple of questions about people signing off on policies. This is a question for Candice or Rodelle. When an employer brings in a new workplace policy like this for existing employees, is there any requirement that employees have to agree to that policy, or does the employer have the right to just bring a policy in place like this?
Yeah, generally speaking, an employer has a right to introduce or to amend reasonable policies and procedures for the workplace, and I don't see that this is any different. There are some specific requirements in the regs in terms of how the employer needs to give notice of the policy to their employees, such as providing it to them personally or posting it in the workplace. But as long as those requirements are complied with, it's not a scenario where, for example, the employee needs to sign acknowledgement of receipt for it to be binding. That is a practice that some employers use on their policies, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But it is not a legal requirement.
Okay, thank you. So if a business wants to implement this, so by the way, Tom clarified that PVNT is proof of vax or negative test, which was great. Thanks, Tom. And I like the abbreviation. That's probably going to become a new thing. Okay, so the question here from back office in the chat is, if a business implements mandatory vaccination or negative test to their client, how do we get the test to do at our workplace? So if they first of all, are employer administered tests applicable? Is that a situation? Because I've had several employers ask, can we administer and supervise the administration of the testing? Is that valid? And if so, where do they find tests?
Sorry, I can answer that one, Mark. So employers with fewer than 200 employees can apply through the Saskatchewan Health Authority Test to Protect program for rapid antigen testing, antigen tests on site. I can tell you that Due to the current situation in the province, those tests are a little bit harder to come by than they would have been a couple of months ago, but they are available through the Test to Protect program. Employers over 200 can apply directly to Health Canada for rapid antigen testing or rapid antigen tests and can receive those free of charge.
Okay, thanks, Jen. We've got 9 minutes left. I thought we might run out of questions. We're definitely not going to run out of questions. So, but I am going to try and get through as many as we can in the last 7 or 8, 9 minutes we have here. So here's one from Wendy. If someone says they can't get vaccinated for religious reasons, what type of proof needs to be accepted? So somebody comes up with yeah, I guess we won't give any more preamble. What kind of proof is needed if you have an objection on religious grounds?
It doesn't actually bind. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I'll start, and if our legal experts want to weigh in, they can, or tell me that I'm just off base. But what I've been telling folks is that I wouldn't even ask for anything from them. If they're religiously objecting to getting vaccinated, that's fine. Their alternative is to provide a negative COVID-19 test. Their religious objection doesn't protect them from that off ramp, and so, you know, if that's something, if perhaps they're a Jehovah's Witness or whatever, I don't think that you need to investigate that if you offer them the off ramp of providing you with a negative COVID-19 test.
I'd follow somebody to church for like months on end to make sure that they were showing up every Sunday or Saturday or Friday, as the case might be. But no, I do not do that. That is not legal or sound advice. Please don't follow that advice. No, I think that's right, Ken, is that's the whole purpose of having the testing off ramp, right? Is that there's no objection to that, right? Okay. Here's a question from Janet. We want to keep our clients safe too, so not just employees, but clients. Do we have the right to ask our non-vaccinated employees to share their status with clients, or is it up to the client to ask? So as a contractor, can you be proactive in almost saying, hey, we're all vaccinated, so you want to work with us or something like that? Or is that, I mean, it's questionable, but I think that's what she's getting at, is can we use this as a mechanism for sharing with our clients? Thoughts on that from anyone?
Well, I think it comes back to making sure that you have a policy in place as an organization. I think that your best advertisement to companies that want to hire you is that you can say we have a proof of vaccination or negative COVID-19 test policy in place, and that you can assure that our staff are either tested or are fully vaccinated. So I think that's a way to go. If there wasn't a policy in place, I think I'd turn that one over to our legal experts.
Okay, go ahead, Candice.
Well, I think that's very excellent advice, and further to the question about whether it's not a policy, I would be really extremely hesitant to be sharing whether employees are vaccinated or tested or anything with anybody outside of the organization, or for that matter, even within the organization, those that don't have that need to know. The privacy laws generally require you as an employer to take care in your collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. And I don't think this is any different.
Okay. So there's a question here from Rebecca. If someone takes a PCR or a rapid test, how do we verify the results? Is this word of mouth? Do they have to show us the text or hand in the results? What's considered proof from the testing perspective?
Yeah, sure. I can start that one off too, Mark. So one of the reasons why the government of Saskatchewan is choosing to only accept antigen tests from approved Saskatchewan Health Authority suppliers, which is generally Quantum Genetics out of Saskatoon, Tech, and Nobel, is that there's some certainty that those tests are being conducted on the person that it says that they're conducted on, when it says that they're conducted, and that the tests are producing a valid record. So it provides that rigor within the system. which is why those are really identified in the public sector employer regulations. Those are also the tests that are accepted for patronage at things like bars and restaurants and gyms and fitness facilities. If an employer chose to do something else, I would actually recommend that they follow along with the Health Canada and SHA advice with the Test to Protect program and procuring them through Health Canada, which is often recommended that you have a specific employee that is responsible for conducting the tests on a regular basis, and then keeping records in terms of whether or not it was negative and you're good to go, and then just keeping tabs on the employees that have to check in from time to time with their negative tests. So rather than simply accepting somebody's test that they picked up on Amazon or at Shoppers Drug Mart and says that they produced a swab that they're negative, you would want to have some rigor in place to make sure that you've got some validity to your own policy.
Okay, thank you. Got 3 more questions I want to try and get to in the time. If we have more, we'll tackle them. But so this question was posted twice, probably by the same person, because they were wondering why I hadn't asked it. Just so they know, I was waiting till the end. A company's policy on vaccinations may be considered legal if the government that regulates the workplace mandates vaccinations for that particular workplace or sector of employment. At this time, what sectors or industries have federal or provincial government mandated proofs of vaccine or negative test requirements for employment? I don't know if anybody has the specific answer to what sectors have this in place yet, probably not at your fingertips, but is anybody paying attention to that? Like, is there a place where somebody could go to find out what sectors have mandated proofs of vaccine?
We don't have a comprehensive list of that. Through our regular channels, we usually get a sense of who's adopting and who's not, but I don't think there's a registry that's being created for employers.
Is that something that's been considered?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. So here there was a mention about that a list of employees with a tick box next to them might be enough information provided, right, from a contractor to a client. What if the client still wants to see the record? So is that if a client still wants to see the record, is that something that a contractor is obligated to provide? Can they fall back on their protection and say, I'm sorry, that's not something we can provide? What any thoughts on how a contractor handles that if the client wants more information than would otherwise normally be acceptable? Somebody want to take a crack at that? There we go. Thanks, Ken.
Well, at the risk of thinking out loud, and maybe Clint, that you can help me out with your this is what we're doing answer. In terms of if there's some question, there is an audit process and proof can be requested. Now that if that's an outside contractor, perhaps that adds a complexity to it. But
I'm not sure there is a clear-cut answer on this one. We would be relying on the contract, the employer for whom the contractor works. We'd be relying on them. I don't think we're going to be seeking that proof directly. Can you ask for it? Well, I guess you can ask for anything that you want. I'm not sure that either party is obligated to provide at this point. I'm sorry, I don't have a clear answer for you on that one.
Okay, so I have 2 questions that we're going to wrap up with, and then we will, I'm sorry to those whose questions we didn't get to. We will filter through those and try and get answers and include them in the written submission of Q&As that we'll be providing. The first question that of the last 2 is from Jared Hillman. As you know, this has been a very controversial public topic. Many business owners are feeling extremely trapped, confused, and frustrated with these mandates. Who best should we contact with any further concerns, questions, and frustrations? And I know the answer is Ken Dueck and his team from the government perspective, but I think what Jared is expressing is something we're all feeling, right? Overwhelmed, uncertain, frustrated, scared, and a lot of other things all at once. all while trying to run a business, keep that business solvent, meet the needs of our clients, and keep our employees employed. So so Rodelle, I'm going to ask you, sorry to put you on the spot here, but what advice do you have for people in managing that and who they should be reaching out to? And then Ken, maybe if you can give your perspective in terms of how people can access the BRT, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think depending on like the situation, it could be anywhere from like reaching out to a third-party HR consultant, for example, for some specific advice, or if you want to vent. There's also like legal advice, reaching out to your legal counsel. Government advice, I guess you guys will be able to provide some more insight if there's exact contact information, but I think it just depends on what the topic is. And I think everyone is really open to discussing all these things and issues as they come up, since it is new for everyone and we're all navigating this.
Thanks, Rodelle. Ken?
Well, of course, people are free to contact the business response team 1-855 number at any time. We're definitely here to help people navigate through the public health measures that are in place and what available support that the government can provide to certain situations. We're definitely here for that. People do definitely call the BRT and express frustration about things, and you can certainly do that. I can tell you though that public health measures in Saskatchewan, I've observed over the last 18 months, are not done lightly, and they're certainly not done without the knowledge and care of how it's going to impact employers and businesses. That's part of why the business response team is here, is to be able to reflect those views as public health measures are being considered and contemplated. And we found that that our health ministry and Dr. Schaub, our chief medical health officer, have been very receptive to hearing the concerns and issues of businesses as they contemplate public health measures and implement them as well. So implementation problems, please feel free to make those us aware of those, and we can make sure that those are included in deliberations for any kind of future or amended public health measures as well.
Thanks, Ken. I'm going to start with you for this last question. Anybody else who'd like to add anything can? This comes from Tom Redhead. This is a callback way to earlier in the webinar, Ken, when you had mentioned that part of the purpose of this is basically to inspire people to get vaccinated, right? And I think that the government has been pretty clear about that. As employers, how far can employers go with inspiring our staff to get vaccinated, discussing policies with them and things like that, without getting into human rights hot water or pressuring people to do things? So what advice do you have for employers as they're trying to encourage people to get vaccinated, given the climate of concern that exists here?
Yeah, well, perhaps our legal experts can weigh in on anything that I might say about this as well. But this is obviously a source of public discourse, and I think that it's fair to communicate to your employees that the easiest thing to do in terms of these policies is to get vaccinated. They're free, and they're really intended to protect not only you as an individual, but the rest of society as well. And what we're seeing right now is tremendous pressure on our public health system. Our hospitalizations are at record high levels, and our ICUs are at record high levels. And really getting more and more people vaccinated is a way through this. And of course, the public policy purpose of these public health measures is to encourage people to get vaccinated. I don't think there's any problem as an employer communicating that to people. I think you'd want to shy away from any kind of means of coercion, because you don't want to be coercing people into this. But we are trying to make it uncomfortable for people who are unvaccinated, and that's why we've put in restrictions around things that you're able to do within Saskatchewan through the public health orders, and of course enabled these regulations for employers to enact policies to require proof of vaccination in the workplace as well. So I don't know, I'll turn it maybe over to Candice and Rodelle if they have any further comments on that.
Well, and I would just invite everybody, this is that's the last question. So last comments from everybody would be great.
No, I think Ken summed that up quite appropriately, and certainly no concern with the messaging that he's recommended there. I think the one takeaway I would hope people have from this is to get a policy and to have that policy align closely, at least as closely as possible with the regulations. We don't know where things are going to fall on all of this legally, but in terms of minimizing risk, that's where we're recommending people go at this point.
Okay, Rodelle, and then Clint will give you the last word.
Yeah, nothing more really to add on that Inspire question. I think there's nothing wrong with employers trying to promote vaccines and implement a policy, and the whole, again, back to the purpose, to get us all back to the way things were a year and a half ago.
Thanks, Rodelle. Clint?
I won't add anything onto this, but just to thank everybody for the questions. I appreciate the candidness of the conversation, and for everybody else on the panel this morning. These are tough. It's an extremely divisive issue, and there's a lot of emotion that comes with it as well. So one of the things that, again, that we're doing here is to, again, promote this is a safe workplace. This is how we're doing it. And it's also just encouraging everybody to be respectful. People are coming from very different places, and as a few people on the call have indicated before, you don't know where people are coming from. They might have somebody in their family or their close circle who have been impacted by this, either medically or financially or business. So again, a big message for us is just continue to be respectful at all levels throughout this, whether your clients, your subcontractors, your employees, most of all the government, of course. But anyway, we are here to help. We appreciate all the questions and comments, and Ken is available 24/7. We're cloning him as we speak. But in all seriousness, we're really here to help, and just a great, I'd be remiss if I didn't pass along a message from our minister to say thank you. This is why we do it. We want to keep business going, and the work of the private sector and industry has been absolutely tremendous. The support that you've shown to implement, and also to do the right thing. The questions are coming out of a good place. People are really wanting to do just that. And we know you're trying to, and be patient a little bit as we work through some of these issues, but we can't thank you enough for the work that you've done to keep the economy going. That we can't thank you enough. That's why we're here. That's why we do what we do. So anyway, we appreciate you on that, and don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, thanks, Clint. Thank you to all four of you for making time and for answering questions that we don't know the answers to as best as you can, and for genuinely being here to help. And I know it's appreciated. It's a tough and challenging time for everybody. And I would echo what you say, Clint, is that, and I noticed evidences of it in the chat that of people saying things and then apologizing for it and meaning well. And I think we got to maintain who we are, which is, kind and respectful. And I think that's important. I just want to let everybody know as we wrap up, I apologize that we ran late, but I'm sure we could be going for another hour and still answering questions. So we're going to do our very best to get the recording out ASAP, along with a bit of a summary of what we know today and the Q&As within the next couple of days. And so I can't say that that's going to happen today, but we'll get all of these to you as quickly as we can, certainly this week, not just through our association, but through all of the associations that were part of this. Thank you to all of our partners. I think there were 9 plus our association that were part of this. Thanks to everybody for helping put it on. And as always, you feel free to reach out to your industry associations who are here to help and help you navigate this. And we'll get to work making sure that you have the resources you need to put in place the policies that will help protect you and your employees and help all of Saskatchewan emerge from this pandemic. So thanks, everybody. Take care and have a great rest of your day.